And we are live.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and mute all my stuff. All right, give me a minute. All right, fellow panelists, can you all see that? Want to make sure we're all good to go. Great. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Danielle Johnson of Inclusive Growth Strategies. We're excited this morning to have you all tuning in. We'll be talking about a number of things: implicit bias, microaggressions, and we want to ensure that you all understand that this is very basic understanding. We want to make sure that we're all starting at the same level in our training, but I'm going to stop talking for a moment so my fellow conversational catalysts can share a little bit about themselves.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joseph Shepard. I serve as the Sedgwick County Democratic Party chair. I'm really excited to be here with you all this morning and lean into discomfort with grace as we learn more about this important work.
Good morning. My name is Nikayla Pack, and I am also excited to be here and to share how mindfulness can lessen implicit biases and go into that conversation with you.
All right, let's get into this thing. We have about an hour and 10 minutes to conquer the world in D&I. So we're going to take you through this. When we do our trainings, we really like to start off with conversational expectations so that we're all on the same page. Please feel free to use these in your daily life as we are sharing this information as you all dive into your own conversations. So we want to ensure that we reserve the right to halt the conversation, but given how this is set up, we'll be really having an opportunity to share more with you. Please feel free to interact with us on the YouTube chat. We'll be checking that out. We want to make sure that we have a productive dialogue this morning. Listen without bias is very important. Many times we don't even realize all the biases that we have going on in the background. Challenge yourself to understand other perspectives. This is an opportunity for us to be open, to listen, to learn. And we don't expect you to agree with everything we're sharing. That's the importance of this whole training, is to be able to understand, hear what we're saying, and challenge maybe your own ideologies, values, and beliefs. Park the car, which is one of our favorites. Please feel free to ask your question in the chat. We are not looking for you to be politically correct. This is an educational space. So if there is a question that comes in and others actually see it or feel like, oh, why are you asking that? Again, we're utilizing this space as educational. And so we want you to feel like you can ask those questions, have some really good responses and some really good dialogue. You can also contact us after the training to go in a little bit more depth if we didn't get an opportunity to really drill into your question and answer. Freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence. We have the right to say what we like, but we also have to understand what we say is important and can impact and infect and hurt many. So being mindful of what we are saying as we move forward is very important. Double confidentiality, if you so choose and feel like this is an intimate enough space and want to share a little bit about your background or maybe an experience that you have had, we welcome that, but we ask that folks are not sharing that information outside of our virtual space. Continue the dialogue with others, because many times we see that people join these conversations that are having them in silos or only with people that they feel the most safe. The only way we can create change is having these conversations with those that don't regularly have these discussions, and lean into discomfort with grace. I will also share a caveat that we do have our kiddos here. So if you hear babies in the background, they're also learning this information alongside you all.
There we are. I'm unmuted now. I would love for those who are open to it to begin this conversation with a mindful minute. This would be so we can tap into our physiology and bring some focus and some awareness to the discussion we're about to have. So how I would start this is get in a comfortable position if you're not already. Feet can be on the floor, hands in your lap. And we'll begin by just taking a deep breath in through the nose. Hold it for a moment. And then release that. We'll do that a few more times. And this will just bring awareness to the conversation, bring an openness, allow us to have clarity of thought, and relax us a little bit. So with your last few breaths, set the intention for this conversation to come in with an open mind, a willingness to learn, and thank yourself for being here. All right. So with that, let's engage on how does bias show up in our party? Where are those quick judgments and assumptions of people and situations? So what does implicit bias mean to you? Does it bring up an awareness that everyone has biases and there are attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding and behavior unconsciously? How has bias shown up in your work? If you think about it, is there a tunnel vision? Same views, same results, same decisions? You could think about your recruitment processes. Are you looking in the same places for candidates, for volunteers? Personally, there was an instance where I was sending out applications and I wasn't to places I was qualified for, and I was not getting anyone emailing me back. And I thought, maybe it's my name. So I put my phonetic spelling on my resume and then sent out to some job boards, and I started getting calls back. So just thinking about those type of things. What have you done to combat bias showing up in your work? Have you taken a step back, become aware of the biases and importance to look outside of the in-group? Who isn't in your natural or immediate group? Are you challenging your decisions? And what have you done to prepare yourself to work with diverse populations? Have you taken the implicit association test? You know, there was the Pew research came out that 4 out of 10 think double standards for women seeking top leadership in politics and business. There are double standards. 4 out of 10 think that. And 2 million professionals and managers leave their jobs due to unfairness, which costs 64 billion in business. So those little bits of information that we're getting, 11 million bits of information that we're getting, and we can only digest about 40 of them. We need to challenge ourselves. So we need to think about these things and ask these questions.
And now we're going to talk about common language. And when we're talking about implicit bias or racism, discrimination, we need to understand what the common language is. So implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. I want to put an emphasis on that because many times a lot of people will get offended when we say that they are participating or reacting with implicit bias. And many times we don't know that we are doing it because it's done in an unconscious manner. These biases encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments. They're activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. So as we dive deep into our conversation this morning, we think it's really imperative for you all to understand some of the common language that is used. I will not give an example of every single term because I don't want to insult your intelligence, but I do want you all to pay attention to a couple of things here. So equality is giving everyone the same exact resources. Equity involves distributing those resources based on the needs of the recipients. For example, I work in higher education. Obviously, it's no secret. Many of our institutions and educational facilities are now remote. And so many of our educational facilities across Kansas have decided to provide Wi-Fi and or provide a device to students in low-income communities. That is equality, making sure that all of our students have the technology resources to continue their education. But equity says, let me get down to the specific needs of each individual student. Maybe there are visually impaired students that need Braille embedded on their keyboard of their laptop. Perhaps there are individuals who live in rural parts of Kansas that need certain types of broadband. We have to be mindful that equality is not the same thing as equity. Providing the resources to everyone is one thing. Making sure everyone has the same resources and the individual unique resources that they need to be able to participate at the same level is a different story. Institutional racism is a form of racism that is embedded in a normal practice. So we see that through policy, we see that through systems, we see that through protocol. Racism, a belief that a race is a superior, is better than another. Diversity, making sure that we are paying attention to the unique experiences and the unique identities that make up an individual. And then inclusion, right? It's a little different than diversity, making sure that we're creating a space within our organizations, our party, our companies to welcome everyone from all walks of life.
It's important to understand why D&I should be a priority, having an understanding of the experience of diverse people. And we are a global society, so we're becoming an ever diverse cultural group of people, no matter where you're from. Joseph talked about rural. There are several areas, and understanding the culture of those areas is so important. An inclusive environment minimizes an insider versus outsider culture. We all know what it's like to be a part of the group. We also know what it's like to not feel like you fit, particularly when you're an underrepresented person, right? When you are not a part of the majority and you step into that space, many times you feel that only one in the room or that oneness. Improves productivity, morale, innovation, and the total quality of your organization. Recruitment and retention rates are higher as people are able to bring their authentic self to an organization. When you have to spend a lot of time conforming and assimilating, you are holding back the ability to have diversity showcased, which means that people are not being able to bring their full ideas, their full self to a program, to an idea, to the table. So what's the business imperative? Many times we talk about D&I in the feel-good sense, or it's just the right thing to do. And I believe that we all believe it is the right thing to do when we think about common good and our moral compass. But let's talk about the dollars and cents. Companies with more than 30% of women executives were more likely to outperform companies where this percentage ranged from 10 to 30. So when we have women at the helm, and Kansas right now is showcasing that with all the women that we have running right now. We are showcasing the importance of being able to put women at that executive level. Diverse teams see a 60% improvement in decision-making abilities with diversity and inclusion at the table. Research has found that a strong, homogeneous culture can stifle natural cognitive diversity due to the pressure to conform. If employees or volunteers don't feel like they can be themselves at work or in their organizations, they're more likely to fear rejection and not produce their best work. So we're even holding back the ability to have that cognitive diversity at the table. A 2015 McKinsey report, and they're really a great reporting space to learn more about where we are with companies in D&I and management. So I encourage you all to check out that report. That on 366 public companies found that those in the top quartile for ethnic and racial diversity in management were 35% more likely to have financial returns above the industry means. So when we embrace diversity and inclusion, when we embrace particularly racial, ethnic, and gender diversity, we see growth and we see large returns. So there is a business imperative when we talk about D&I.
So if we take a look at this picture, this snapshot of Congress, we've got the Americas has the most diverse Congress right now, or in this snapshot. And I think of this as a snapshot it captures a moment in time. And then we can see from these next two pictures that you'll see that we are diversifying our leadership in Congress. And if you think about Kansas, we can see this happening here locally. And as Danielle just mentioned the importance and how that can amplify the efficiency and the overall production of organizations, it's very important to take a look at these type of snapshots. And what does your volunteer group look like? What does your leadership group look like? Is there opportunity for growth and to continue to move forward to combat those unintentional exclusions, perhaps? Who's at the table? Who isn't at the table? So this brought to my mind right now what I'm working on, and the Sedgwick County, the district court bench, that snapshot. What does that look like? And there was an opportunity for a powerful change, and Governor Kelly appointed Judge Centeno. And so now this bench looks a little bit different. So it's just to take a look at these photos, and then take that back and perhaps take a snapshot of your tables.
So when we go a little bit more into implicit bias, this goes into how are we creating those tables? Who are we tapping? Implicit bias really talks more about who you decide to help versus who you decide to stay away from. And so we are certainly not scientists, but we do know that implicit bias starts in the brain. So that red piece right there at the middle, you can see is the amygdala. And the amygdala is one of the oldest pieces of our brain, right? This is the space that tells us and processes in our minds how we react to something. It's a processing powerhouse. It tells you to fight, flight, or freeze. When you think about our earliest people, they had to figure out, do I eat that berry off that tree? Do I hug that bear, or do I run away from that bear, or is that bear dinner? That's what our mind has done for us. That correlates to our hippocampus, which forms links in the brain, information, memories, and that's where those spaces are processed, right? So when we think about the information processing system, our temporal lobe integrates sounds and words. Our medial cortex has empathy, emotional responses, and rational thought, and all of those things work in tangent for us to actually create implicit bias. Sometimes when we think about driving home, if you've ever driven home and you kind of spaced out and you realized you just got there and you don't remember how, that's these pieces working to get you home. When you think about a smell that takes you to your grandma's house, or a memory, that's these pieces coming together to create that memory, that piece, that warm smell, that good feeling, or maybe it's a bad feeling that triggers in your mind. But these are all the pieces that work together for you to create bias, or not just implicit, but even actual explicit bias, right? And those are the things that we are aware of. Your mind is a powerhouse, so you can really process millions of things per second, but you cognitively, thinking, sitting, being cognitive in your space, can only process about 40 pieces of information. So think about that. Your mind is making quick snap judgments. They're making quick associations so you're able to function. Think about the last time you actually had to sit in a chair and think about that process, or walking to something. If your mind had to actually, if you had to physically pay attention to every single thing you were doing, you would explode. So implicit bias has always been there. It's something that is deep within our minds.
Yes, and as Danielle mentioned, the amygdala is the oldest piece in the brain. And when we are meeting new people, or we're in a new situation, a new experience, it flares up. So for that evolutionary process, but we don't necessarily need it to flare up. So mindfulness, being aware of our thoughts, of our patterns, can actually decrease its activation and then increase our prefrontal cortex activation, which is going to allow us to bring rational thought into our process. So it will create a little bit of space of, okay, let me assess this situation. Let me not react. Let me actually respond, think about my biases, and then proceed with whatever situation or meeting a new person in a different manner. So it allowing ourselves to actually take this rational thought is going to provide for more inclusion. Perhaps you would unintentionally have a quick judgment or a quick assessment of someone as they walk into the door. This can allow space for, okay, maybe this volunteer is coming in and they look a little bit rough, but let me not just straight judge them on that or think, no, I don't want to send them here to do that because they probably aren't qualified. So this will allow you to have a little bit of space and just to have a conversation with this person, and perhaps they were the best person for that position. So just be mindful and aware of our thoughts, our unconscious thoughts at that.
Schemas also play a role in implicit bias. We also know how when we walk into a space, because of culture, because of structures, we know how to show up in these different schemas, these spaces, right? So you have your person schemas, you have your social schemas, self schemas, event schemas. For example, we have a date on the screen. You might tell yourself, I normally eat garlic bread, but I'm on a date. So my social schema says, I'm not going to eat this garlic bread. I want to be able to get closer to this person potentially. And so we're cognizant of how to act in a certain space. Professionalism. When you go onto the job, there may be certain schemas, right? There may be this kind of cultural awareness of, I know I can't wear a t-shirt and jeans unless it's Friday. And on Friday, we can be a little bit more informal. And we set these spaces up so we know how to interact. That being said, some of these things are, again, ingrained. So there was a study that was done with children, and they were very young children. And there were two groups. One group was shown photos of men and women doing what we like to call traditional jobs, right? So women were inside cooking and cleaning. Men were outside cutting the grass, mowing the lawn, which is the same thing, putting oil in the car, right? So those kind of traditional male and female roles. And the other group was shown photos of men doing what we consider women's work, them cleaning and cooking, and women outside mowing the lawn and putting oil in vehicles. They were given a little bit of time, and they brought the kids back in later that day, and they asked the group that saw the opposite photos what they recall. More than half of those kids put women back into cleaning the house and men mowing the lawn, meaning that those associations were already ingrained in young children. And when we think about the toys that are bought for our children, when we say this is girl stuff, pink is girl, blue is boy, that goes into those schemas as well, how we interpret the data and the information that we get and how we conceptualize these ideas, these structures. Because again, right, there's no such thing as a woman's job or a men's job or a man's job. These are structures that are implemented in us. And so they show up in our everyday work. And we have to actively work to change our cognitive framework around these ideas of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a transgender person, what it means to see someone in a wheelchair. We have to make sure that we understand that there's more to the story than what our mind has played out for us.
And going off of what our mind has shown us and what has been ingrained in us since a young age, right? We all have to take a look at some of the things that we've been taught in associations and how that plays in what we perceive people to be, their capabilities. It was said earlier, you know, if someone walks into your campaign headquarters and they want to volunteer and you look at them and judge them, 9 times out of 10, it's probably because what you have been taught to associate with particular people or things. So as we look at different colors, right? When we see the color red, we expect to see a certain color. When we look at black, we expect to see a certain color. And why? That is because from probably pre-K, we have been taught that when we see these particular colors, this is what you call it. For some of us, it was prior to pre-K or prior before even entering into an educational setting. So these associations are ingrained in us from the time that we are born, for many of us, all the way up into our adult lives. However, as we flip the script here, and we look at associations in action, we look at the screen and we see that red is actually green. And that does something to us. And we say, this isn't right because this isn't what I was taught. And so when we look at implicit bias and when we look at the role that it plays in how we interact with individuals, how we slate candidates, how we recruit candidates to run in certain districts or certain areas for certain positions, we have to recognize that implicit bias and the associations that we've been taught to give to certain people plays a huge role. We've seen that recently with Dr. Boyer and Roger Marshall, right? He did not think someone like Dr. Boyer would understand agriculture or what's it like to live in rural Kansas or how to identify wheat. And surprise, she did, because he allowed those associations and those stereotypes to determine what she was capable of doing. And many times we do that. And particularly in the political world, we have to be careful of doing that, because what we do is we end up excluding candidates that truly can be the best servants for our communities and neighborhoods.
I'm going to make a quick transition here to show a clip to better understand what we mean by implicit bias, and also understanding that it is pretty natural to us. Natural as peanut butter and jelly, actually. So give me a second to prepare my screen.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes the shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We'd never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day.
All right, can you all see the screen again? The PowerPoint? Okay. That being said, that kind of went more in depth of, right, peanut butter and jelly, implicit bias, having an idea of what we think something is incredibly ingrained. We see it in media. When we think about the cycle of socialization, we're born, families maybe pour into us, we go into a school system, or maybe we're homeschooled, and we're socialized in these spaces, in these structures. And so oftentimes we're sharing some of these cultural dynamics because we've heard and seen these things for years. So then now you add social media and the advancement of technology, we are seeing stereotypes day in and day out really ingrained within us, and many times enforcing the wrong thoughts, notions, and ideas, particularly if we stay in the same circles. So when we look at the photos that we have on the screen, there is something triggering in our minds right now. Our amygdalas are going to work, our prefrontal cortex, all of those things are happening. And uh, depending on how you are socialized will also depend on how you look at these things, right? How I was raised to interact with police officers may be vastly different than how you all tuning in were raised to interact with police officers. When I turn on my Facebook or when I turn on the media and I see folks that look like me experiencing police brutality, I may have a different thought or a different trigger in me when a police officer pulls up behind me. It's certainly not all about police officers, but that's the most relevant and tangible thing we're seeing happening today. When we think about the coronavirus and when you think about country of origin, what are we calling the virus? Some of us are actually using the technical terms like COVID-19, while others of us are saying things like the Kung flu or the China virus. And these are things that create problems for our Asian Americans in our country or our immigrants. And so when they go to the store and someone attacks them, or if they have fear to cough in public, that is our implicit biases that are our biases at play. And those are the fears that we are harboring. And how is it showing up potentially in our volunteer headquarters, or when we're working alongside our candidates, or how seriously we take a candidate based on some of these ideas? When we look at protesters, what do we believe? Do we understand what they're actually saying, or are we tying things to them that aren't true? Do we truly understand what the words defund the police mean? Do we truly understand what the terms Black Lives Matter mean? Do we truly understand the importance of immigration? And when we see children in cages, what are those things eliciting in our minds? Jerry Kang has a study on implicit bias, and he's somebody out of UCLA and does an incredible job at continuing to break it down. But I spoke a little bit about how the media plays into it. And briefly, just to give a little bit of the background on this, when we think about journalism, we'll read this quote directly. Pew Project for Excellence in Journalism's annual study of local news programming consistently finds that local newscasts spend approximately 25% of their time on crime stories. As often said, if it bleeds, it leads. Violent crimes news stories frequently involve racial minorities, especially African Americans, in part because racial minorities are arrested for violent crimes more frequently on a per capita basis than their white counterparts. Even holding arrest rates constant, certain minorities appear to be overrepresented as perpetrators and underrepresented as victims on television news. Travis Dixon and Daniel Lenz examined local news broadcasts in Los Angeles and Orange counties in California and computed differentials between television crime rates and real world crime rates. They found, for example, that Blacks were portrayed as victims of homicide only 23% of the time, whereas their victimization rate was 28%. Whites were portrayed as victims 43% of the time on the news, although their actual victimization rate was 13%. On the perpetrator side, TV news portrayed Blacks as perpetrators 36% of the time, although the actual arrest rate percentages were of 21%. Do we see the disproportions in those numbers? We are overrepresenting people of color, those that are Muslim, those that are marginalized as the criminals than what's actually going on. We showcase here a news station that is same reporter, same news station, and how we're highlighting two very similar crimes. We see this all the time. Our group recently did some training with our news stations, and our local news stations, at least here in Wichita, are seeing and asking the question, what can we do to ensure that we are not helping to embed implicit bias into our communities?
And with that, implicit bias has friends. There's more to it. There's other biases. There's often things that we get stuck on just one idea. So yes, there is more that we need to be aware of. And that reminds me of the G.I. Joe fallacy, which states that just knowing isn't enough. These thoughts, ideas, behaviors, they're ingrained in us. So simply just knowing that they're there, knowing that you have them, that's definitely a start, but you have to actively challenge yourself to combat that, to change your behaviors. And taking a moment to breathe before situations, taking a moment to breathe before you respond to something, taking a moment to, just like that news article, taking a moment to really question that and not just make a snap judgment on it. So to get into some of these other biases, confirmation bias. So as the example, or as a video showed, Black men are often portrayed more in violent crimes. So we can think of a police detective. They may identify a suspect early in an investigation, but they may only seek confirming rather than disconfirming evidence. So a confirming bias, it often occurs from the direct influence of desire on beliefs. When people would like a certain idea or concept to be true, they end up believing it to be true. They are motivated by wishful thinking. This error leads the individual to stop gathering information when the evidence gathered so far confirms the views or prejudices one would like to be true. So as an example I gave you, that detective was seeking the confirming evidence rather than disconfirming. So once that was received, the investigation was stopped. We can also see this with what people only watching a certain news channel to confirm their beliefs or ideas. Fake news, political scandals, they may confirm what you thought about a candidate. And that's where your quick judgment, where your assessment then comes in, and everything else you're not hearing. In-group favoritism. In-group favoritism is sometimes known as in-group, but this is evolutionary as well. We were in our groups for safety reasons, and we shared resources within our groups. So you can think about how the group that I am in, how are we allocating resources? Are we keeping them all to ourselves within our group? Out-group bias, in-group bias, or intergroup bias. That's a pattern. It's a pattern of favoring members of one's in-group over out-group members. This can be expressed in evaluation of others and allocation of resources and many other ways. So once again, who's at your table and who isn't, and how are you thinking of the others that are not in that group. And then affinity bias is the unconscious tendency to get along with others who are like us. It is easy to socialize and spend time with others who are not different. It requires more effort to bridge differences when diversity is present. So we can think of this as once again, who we are asking to represent us, who we are asking to volunteer, who is in those groups. And it is easier to socialize with those like us because we do not have to deal with perhaps any microaggressions, or they understand where you're coming from. So when we're seeking new representation or seeking to diversify groups, this can definitely be something that needs to have your awareness and for you to challenge who are you talking to. So these friends of implicit bias definitely need to be on your radar and something that you're challenging yourself with. And it is all connected. The intersectionality of all these identity markers is an important concept to think about as well, because they don't exist independently of each other. Each informs the other. You're a Black male who has a master's degree. They all inform one another, as I said. So you can also think about this as can be a complex convergence of oppression. So if you think of the Black man makes, I believe it's 74 cents and the white woman makes 78 cents to the white man's dollar. So that's a complex convergence of oppression where it's not just male, it's not just woman. Other markers, identity markers, play into it and inform the other. So it's all connected.
Right. And it's all connected, which is why we have to be sure that we're recognizing microaggressions. And long story short, microaggressions can be defined as statements or words that we say that can be perceived as harmful or discriminatory towards one identities. And there's several ways that microaggressions show up every single day. When we say things like white privilege doesn't exist, it is saying that differences in racial privilege doesn't show up at a personal level. When we say different things like, oh girl, I like your hair, to an African-American woman, can I touch it, right? It's almost as if we're treating human beings, African-American human beings, like animals, right? And they're human beings. If we don't want to touch the European beauty standard centric hair, why would we try to do that to someone else of a different background? So we have to be mindful of the microaggressions that show up. When we ask that African-American legislator or representative, why are you so angry or so loud? When really that legislator is really just as passionate and assertive as their counterpart. The only difference is race. We have to understand, going back to those associations, why we perceive certain people to be angry or upset or mad when really it's just passion. We have to be mindful that microaggressions show up every single day. And as I tell people all the time in my work, many people don't understand microaggressions. And when we say that they're microaggressions, it doesn't necessarily mean you are angry. But what happens when you get angry? You get frustrated, you get flustered. And when you use microaggressions towards certain people, that is what happens. They start to feel that their mere existence in humanity is under attack, thus making them feel frustrated and angry. So we have to ask ourselves, how do microaggressions show up in the Democratic Party? How are we characterizing our candidates and our representatives of color? How are we characterizing our candidates of a different sexual orientation or religious background, or from ability, non-ability belief? What are the assumptions that we make about candidates? Do we believe that certain candidates of color will never be able to win a race in Western Kansas or parts of Kansas simply because of what our bias and implicit bias and microaggressions say about them? And then also, we have to be sure that we understand that the lack of the understanding of intersectionality, of the volunteer, of the candidate, of the elected official, it really, in my opinion, hurts our party. The more intersectionality we can bring to the table, the more intersectionality we can ensure our candidates and candidates offer, the more relatable it makes them to the working class families and people that we are committed to serving, because they have different perspectives that they can bring to the table to help serve Kansas overall and reach the common good.
And on some of those examples for us, because obviously we're not having the opportunity to be able to interact as much through this virtual training, just some examples that I have seen or experienced when we think about opening up office spaces. Are we making sure that the space is accessible? Are we making sure that those that might be in a wheelchair can get into the space? When we think about providing things in other languages, what are we doing there? I think even recently for the Sedgwick County Democratic Party, are we making sure that we see those religious holidays? And sometimes those things are hard to do, particularly when we have November 3rd is around the corner and we have a lot of work to do. So how are we also honoring the intersectionality of those within our party while ensuring we're getting the work done? Nikayla, you shared a really important example when we were talking about, when we're thinking about space and when we think about things, spaces that are ableist or making sure that people can get into a space. Can you share that?
Yeah, so we had an elder woman come in, and as she was leaving the stairs, she said, "Oh, this is the hard part, you know. Thankfully, there was a ramp towards the back, but we were not aware of that at the beginning. There was no signs, and it was not the main entrance. Someone did come up as she began to walk up and stated, you know, oh, there is a ramp over here to get you out in the hallway. But just being mindful of that, so there's awareness that we have thought of you, and we would like, you know, for you to be able to have access in an equitable way. And as we think about microaggressions and how they show up, how are we responding to them? And are we responding to them? And when are we responding to them? You can think about this if you're out walking, passing out literature, or in the campaign office, if you're with volunteers and you pick up on something, how would you respond? So microaggressions, they're often committed without people realizing it, and they do stem from biases learned over time. So how would you approach that? So oftentimes you can paraphrase and ask for clarity. Make sure that what you heard is what they've stated. So ask them can you explain that a little bit more or elaborate on that? And then separating the intent from the impact. When you're asking for clarity, you know, I think what you said was that person is not qualified. Is that correct? Can you elaborate on what you meant by that? So when you're observing, how are you reacting to these microaggressions? You can ask yourself some questions. Did this microaggression really occur? Should I respond to it? Once again, and how should I respond to it? Often if we share our personal experiences, and perhaps I used to think that way, it lessens the intimidating factor of the person you're questioning. It helps others feel less self-conscious and defensive, not like they're being attacked. And then you also can ask yourself, when addressing or responding to a microaggression, are you doing it to help educate? What's the purpose? What is the space and the place that you're doing it? If you are wanting to correct somebody, that could be an awkward situation depending on who it is. So instead of doing it in front of a group, you may want to take them to the side and address it and say, you know, I overheard you make the comment that Jill is angry. I used to think that too, but then I learned she's just very passionate about this work. So those are some things to think about when responding, sharing your own personal experience. You can also amplify others' voices that validate your colleagues who experienced the microaggression. You can highlight overlooked employees or volunteers that have been committed. And then once again, asking the questions that force whomever made the comment to defend their bad assumptions. With the example, I'm hearing that you say Joan is more aggressive, but I didn't hear you say that about John. What are some specific examples you have that are truly different, that identify why you would think that? And what would make you think that it wouldn't be accurate? So some questions to ask, as well as, you know, the emotional labor, it shouldn't fall on the people from the marginalized group. So in the real world, people are confronted with microaggressions and people need to decide what to do. So you have the ability to think about these things and become a little bit more aware of and pick up on when you are in the office or out walking with volunteers, to pick up on these little comments that, once again, people are saying, sometimes unintentionally knowing that they're saying it. So you have the awareness to respond to them, to ask for clarity, and then shift and educate if the space allows for that. So as an organization, as a party, your role and contributions may look different as the need to create a safe environment for you and others. The focus on creating inclusion an inclusive environment it's even more important, as we talked about the importance of diversity and inclusion and how it empowers and how it produces, better results. As we continue to finish this webinar for you all, you can take into consideration what knowledge, what resources you will need to feel empowered to accomplish this. So currently, what is your current role and contribution with fostering diversity and inclusion in the party? Take a moment to ponder that. What are you doing? Are you doing anything? And for the future, what is your future role and contribution with fostering diversity and inclusion in the party, in your organization? What steps can you take? Can you be more mindful, take a moment and respond to some of these microaggressions? Could you take the implicit bias association test to become more aware of what your biases are, so then you can create space before responding in those situations? Take a moment to think about that. Maybe jot down some action steps and have that be a goal. And here are some resources to further expand your knowledge and awareness of implicit biases and those friends that we mentioned. Here are some books that you can look into, and also some studies. If you're on top of it and you've already checked into some of these resources and would like additional resources, you can always contact us and provide more, because there is a plethora. There's no shortage. There is so much content that can be consumed to help you on this journey, and to be able to then educate others and the work that you all are doing.
So what are those additional action steps? Because we can't just talk about training. We have to make sure that we're doing something about it. Training alone does nothing, but it's the action steps that we take. It's actually doing what we say we're going to do with the information. So here are a couple of things to consider. As Nikayla, our mindfulness guru, said, check your mindset and your empathy levels. We have to embrace this thing called radical empathy, taking the time to really understand the walks and the stories of those that we come across every day. So take some time to learn some mindfulness techniques. When making decisions, slow down, minimize the distractions. If you're like me, I have 2 screens, I have another laptop up, I have my cell phone up, and I'm doing all things. Someone will come into my office and sit down, and I'll say, can I keep working while you're talking? We have to be able to unplug and give our full time and attention to the people that are around us, particularly when we're working on campaigns. Are we making sure that the volunteers got all the instructions, or are we looking at our cell phone and giving haphazard instructions? Do the people truly understand what they're supposed to be doing, or are we assuming that they get it just because we go over a checklist? Are we looking to see if they are really comfortable with minivan, or do they need a printed sheet? Do we need to provide things in Braille? Do we need to be providing things in other languages, right? But that means that we have to stop, slow down, and be mindful, so that we are making sure that we're checking every box. We're examining our thoughts. We're questioning the potential biases that are creeping into our mind when someone walks in the door or asks to be a part of the organization. De-biasing, working to counter the stereotypes that have been living in our minds for a long time that may have been implanted by family, friends, and institutions. Become aware and recognize your triggers. We all have them. I'm someone that has worked in diversity and inclusion work for years, and I have bias as a biracial woman of color, mother, all these different things, all these intersections I still have bias. And just because you may be a part of a minority or marginalized group does not mean that you are educated in all of these issues. So we must hold everyone accountable to these action steps. Assess the bias that creeps into your mind. Where did it come from? Why am I thinking this? Who taught me this? How did I learn this? Is this valid or factual? Take some time to debunk those things. Ask yourself those questions, and that comes with some self-assessment. Then take the time to deconstruct and relearn. And one of the easiest ways to do that, and I'm a big fan of Brian Stevenson, he says, let's get proximate. To get proximate means taking the time to get to know someone outside of your circle, to understand someone else's values, even though they may clash. What are you doing to actively get to know the communities that you know nothing about? It is not uncommon for me to hear someone say, this is the first time I am interacting with someone of color, or I'm not really comfortable with the terminology. I don't really know how to use pronouns. And so I don't want to interact with that volunteer because I know that that volunteer's pronouns are different and I'm afraid to say the wrong thing or use the wrong name. We have to be able to get proximate so that we learn. Mistakes do happen, but when we're intentional and we're working to understand that when someone comes in and they say, hi, my name is Danielle and I go by they, them, that is our job to understand what that person means and that we're respecting the people coming to our office by using the proper names, the proper pronouns, understanding that when a volunteer with disabilities comes in, that we are accommodating them as best we can so that they can feel a part of this party and do the work as well. We have to continue with ongoing training, workshops, and books. Just because you may have sat through this hour and 10 minutes does not mean you are all knowing. This is a step in the right direction to get a baseline. What else are you consuming to do the work? Oftentimes we ask for training, but we just go to the one training and never revisit. We have to continue to learn. Be aware of the cultural norms in the organization, teams, and communities you are working with. When we send volunteers out, candidates out to go to areas, do we make sure that they understand what the norms are? Are there specific greetings we should be using? Are there particular terms that are not okay? It's okay and important to educate our communities as we go out. Do we have interpreters? Do we have Spanish speakers on our team? Do we have someone that speaks Vietnamese? And not for tokenization, but to ensure that we are engaging and making sure that people feel like this party really truly does represent me. When we think about the diversity photo that we put up for the Congress folks that came in 2019, we're growing opportunities for people to see themselves with representation in this party. But are we making sure that we're staying up to date, or are we doing the same old things? Define diversity for your organization and team and put measurements in place. Who are we lacking? Who's not at the table? Why are they not at the table? Are there barriers to access what we're doing? Are we putting up costs that aren't available? Do we need to fundraise to diversify, to be able to make sure that someone can actually step into this space? What are our price points? Be aware of your own biases, prejudices, and privileges. Even statements that seem positive can involve stereotypes. When you're choosing a space, a building, think of accessibility. Look at the full scope of diversity. While it's easy to get pigeonholed in race, ethnicity, and gender, there's a larger scope to diversity. Socioeconomic status, English as a first language or not, right? We have to think about all the different facets that encompass the intersections of a person. And are we actually walking our values as a party that says we are open and diverse and inclusive and equitable? Over-reporting positive behaviors. And Nikayla, I'm actually gonna have you hop in on this.
Yeah, so we oftentimes over-report our positive behaviors, and that can attribute to us thinking we don't need to do the work. We've now done this, you've now done this webinar and you think, okay, I've got it in check, but that may not be the case, because those thoughts, those behaviors, those biases, as you've now learned, seen, and probably knew, they are deeply embedded and unconsciously we're doing them. So we can take a moment and challenge our decisions, to challenge our thoughts, and that will then decrease our over-reporting of our positive behaviors and bring some humility into the learning and into the discussion, so you can then become a little bit more open minded about your own biases and how they can impact your behaviors and your decisions as you're interacting with candidates or volunteers, or how you're wanting to deliver a message, and are you being inclusive with that. So taking that moment to check yourself on, am I actually doing the work and not just feeling that I've got it all. I'm doing just fine.
Don't tokenize, be aware of how you try to relate to a group. Jokes do matter, right? And some of these things you may be thinking, I already know this, but we don't always practice these things. As myself, Nikayla, Joseph, we've worked on a number of campaigns and heard a number of complaints from our fellow volunteers saying, people think that they're diverse and inclusive, yet I'm having this experience on this campaign, or I was given an idea and was shut down, and I believe it was because of one of my identities. These are things that are continuing to happen. So again, check that over-reporting of positive behaviors and our tokenization of the folks that we've recruited into the space. It's incredibly hard, particularly when you have only one person that may be of a underrepresented group in that space. When you have a homogenous space and someone comes in that's a little bit different, a lot of times we go and refer to that person. It's important to build the bench. So if you only have one person with a disability, if you only have one person of the LGBTQ plus community, oftentimes that person is referred to answer the questions and do the work, when we all have to understand our role in making sure that folks feel included, whether we're a part of that community or not. Intentional versus unintentional. If an elephant stands on your foot, it hurts, whether it's on purpose or not. You may not have had the intention of being hurtful or disrespectful, but if it comes off that way, an apology goes a long way, and a willingness to be educated about the person that you may have offended, a willingness to learn more about the culture. Don't assume the majority is the only right or normal way to do things. Oftentimes we hear on campaigns, well, this is how we've always done it. There's an opportunity to try new things, and particularly when you bring in new volunteers. Let folks have the opportunity to fail on their own if that is the case, or take that idea and make it better. We're seeing multicultural and multi-generational groups come forward. But if we are not utilizing the diversity at the table and they're just there in the photos, we're doing a disservice to the people that are doing the work around us. Help people acclimate, not assimilate. We want people to bring their authentic self to the table, so we're able to capitalize on all the great ideas that they're going to bring, their ability to maybe upgrade our technology, the ability to look at our website and say, hey, you're missing this piece, the ability to look at campaign literature and say, you know what, let's change that sentence. But being open to cognitive diversity, all the diversities that are brought to the table to say, you know, we're a better team because we've actually embraced the diversity at this table. Give people an opportunity to tell their own story and learn how to be an ally. And real allies continue to do the work and the research. They know when to speak, and they also know when to stand on the side and let the community speak for themselves. Helping to kind of shift that privilege or provide those resources as an ally. Recognize and be aware of the issues your peers, organizations are facing at the national, regional, and local level. There are no shortage of things going on when we think about COVID-19, LGBTQ rights, Black Lives Matter, the sentiment that all lives matter, Back the Blue, religious discrimination, police brutality, travel bans, deferred action on early childhood arrival or DACA, the Me Too movement, immigration rights, freedom of speech. This list can go on, but these are the things that we are bombarded with. And because we're running in a political nature, these are things that often get politicized. Are we truly on the right side of history? Are we truly doing the work? When we say we're a big tent and everyone is involved and we want everyone to fall under us, do we mean that? So we have an opportunity to take some time to really think about these ideas and do something with them. Our hope is that you have enjoyed this kind of 101. We touched on a number of things, but there are no shortage of strategies for you to consider as we march on to November 3rd. It's important for us to continue to do this work and to be cognizant about our thoughts, our words, our actions. How do we support all of our candidates? How do we embrace D&I? and how do we continue to push our party forward to include everyone. Our hope is that you have enjoyed this time, and if you have any questions or would like to see any of us come out and provide a more in-depth training, myself, Joseph Shepard, Nikayla Pack, we also have other folks on our team, Alicia Sanchez, Brandon Johnson, Shauna Siobhan Stevens. We have a whole cadre of people willing to come out and provide training, and we hope that you all take the time to continue to do workshops and trainings to ensure that we do have a better party. Contact us at Inclusive Growth Strategies. Our contact information is here, inclusivegs@gmail.com, and we will happily continue this dialogue. But don't just talk about it, be about it and do the work. Thank you for joining us, and have a great Sunday.